Let's get started. Thanks to everyone for joining. This is the social media webinar for population and public health researchers. The webinar is hosted by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, specifically the Institute of Population and Public Health. This slide is advertising an upcoming workshop that CIHR is hosting for population and public health trainees and researchers to help you develop communication skills and to get expert feedback and to network with other researchers and journalists. This workshop is happening in June in Montreal, and it is a competitive process, and applications are due March 15th. The website is indicated on this slide where you can find out more information and get the application form. So we would encourage you to apply if you meet the eligibility criteria. And another upcoming event also happening this June in Montreal in conjunction with the Canadian Science Writers Association Conference. We'll be holding a professional development session at the meeting, specifically for journalists to develop their skills in communicating population and public health research. So if you know journalists or science communicators that are interested in covering population and public health research, then encourage them to attend the 2013 Canadian Science Writers Association Conference in June in Montreal. Applications or registration is now open, and the website is listed here on this slide. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the moderator for today's webinar, Ms. Armine Yalnizyan, a senior economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. She's also a business commentator at CBC Metro Morning, and she's a member of our Institute Advisory Board. So Armine, over to you.
So hi everybody, thanks very much for joining. I guess the first things first, I am on the board, and I never know why I'm on this board because I learn more from everybody there than I bring to the table. But I'll tell you one thing, I've been involved in health research for a while, and population health research is different than everything else, as you all know that are on this line. And the fact is that journalists are noted for that famous phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. So how you get the population aware of population health research is part of why I think I'm on the board. And I know that the minute you start talking about social determinants of health or population health, people's eyes glaze over. So that's why we're doing this. We've got this rock star social media communicator to help you along with how you can make your research accessible, how you can work with others to advance your research and to network. You know, the idea of population health could be, you know, anything from how our neighborhoods are designed to the fact that mothers have to work 2 jobs and are still not making enough to get out of poverty, or maybe something completely different that is more along the more physiological end of things. But these are features of how we need to frame our stories, our research questions, and the answers to the research we conduct. The goal of today is to learn how to stop turning off the public. And a lot of our colleagues in the profession, so that they better understand what population and public health research is, what it can do, and what we have already learned. So that's kind of why we're here today. And I tip my cap to the folks at the Institute for Population and Public Health. They get it loud and clear that people do not understand what population and public health is about, and that they need to. And this is the second, as Emma was saying, this is part of an ongoing effort to make do a better job of knowledge translation within the profession and between the profession and the broader public, partly through the media, but partly through just the average person. Now, and that's where Cameron comes in. Now, I've got some great additional biographical notes about Cameron, but what you need to know is you need to follow him on Twitter, and you need to look at his websites that he'll tell you all about. His academic training was in psychology, and he's got a PhD in the behavioral science side of public health, which is kind of interesting. I guess the what makes people tick side of things. And he notes that he's been interested in electronic tools for health since the dawn of the web. That is an awesome statement. Mind you, that's about 6,000 days ago, so it's not that long ago. But you have got with you a pioneer on his doctoral research, looked at how web-based tools could help young people quit smoking or prevent them from starting, part of what Canada is known for internationally in terms of the cessation of smoking. And from 2006 to 2011, he was a full-time professor at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health here in Toronto. Right now, he's busy supporting health, and he's now an adjunct professor, but his work is more focused on supporting health and nonprofit organizations to evaluate what they're doing, learning from what they're doing, and to design and redesign our programs to be more innovative, more adaptive, more responsive to the conditions surrounding us. Great news for a post-economic crisis and in the middle of austerity world. So I turn you now over to Cameron Norman, who's going to guide us through this spectacular deck. Enjoy it, people.
Thank you very much, Armina. It's a thrill to be here to talk about social media for public health and population health. I mean, I realize we don't have a lot of time, and what I would encourage anybody who's interested in this, there are some great resources out on the web that you can take a look at. Armina, you kindly mentioned my blog. I put some things up there. I also, the PTCC in Ontario actually do a series. I work with them to do a series on social media. Jason Chapman and Tara Mayer and myself have done a series of these on introduction, strategy, and evaluation. So if you're interested in more of that detail, I would encourage you to think about that. What I'm going to talk about today is social media specifically targeted towards researchers, and it looked like from our original survey that a lot of you actually are in that camp. Some of you are journalists, and some of you are working in other health professions. And so what I'm going to do today is just kind of give you just an intro to what that might look like in some of the work, why you might want to use social media for research, what it's going to get you in terms of your benefits for research as well as you as a researcher. So why don't we go to the next slide? The biggest thing here that I want you to do as a takeaway from this is not so much about thinking about the specific tools, but is to think about the tools and to change the way you are doing things. Social media is, in some ways, an extension of traditional media, broadcast media, but in many ways it's also a fundamental way of thinking. So if we can get the next slide. Basically, for those of you who can't see that, basically what it is, I've just got a picture of a brain. And most of us probably know about what the brain kind of looks like and that. So the next slide after that, social media is any electronic networked information resource that derives its principal value for user engagement. This is one of the things that distinguishes it from other types of media. Now, some people may argue that we're talking about things like email, which is true, but where this is different is in something that, if you think about things like Facebook, if you think about things like Twitter, if you think about YouTube, if individuals were not contributing anything to it, it wouldn't exist. The joke can always be that there's no reason why Hermit Book never took off and Facebook did, because if you have no friends and if you have no social connections, there's no point in using social media. So this is a fundamental thing that does make a difference. So in fact, from a researcher's standpoint this isn't necessarily just the smartest people in the room, the people with the most knowledge, particular types of knowledge. It's everybody is involved in this. And certainly you can focus your energies a lot on these kinds of things, on particular groups, and have particular Twitter feeds and that sort of stuff that tend to be curated around particular knowledge domains. But nonetheless, it's whatever people want it to be. So if we go to the next slide, what we can take a look at is here what we'll be able to see is basically just a screen with a number of different examples of what we're talking about when we say social media. So it's any type of a networked information resource that drives its principal value from user engagement. But what are we talking about? We're talking about things like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Google+. There's a number of other technologies. And what I would ask you to do is to not necessarily focus exclusively on just the individual technologies. These things will come and go. Right now, Facebook has got over 1 billion users. It's probably not going to go anywhere right away. But if you think about it, Facebook really came into existence in 2005, 2006. It's fairly new to get to 1 billion people. Twitter is not much older than that. It's a little younger than that. YouTube, most of these things were actually started within the last decade. So while that's important, don't get hung up on the particular technologies because some things will come and go. We go to the next slide just to show you again some of the examples for where this stuff looks like. You'll see here on screen some of the different types of technologies out there: Google+, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, Foursquare, Pinterest, and YouTube. These are just some of the major ones that are out there. They all offer very distinctive advantages and disadvantages. Some of them are platforms. Some of them are single-use kind of things. Instagram, for example, is all about sharing photos. So is Pinterest. YouTube, most of us, anybody who's ever watched any video on cats knows what YouTube is. LinkedIn is a professional network. It's kind of Facebook for professionals, for those of you who don't know. Foursquare is a geolocation tool that allows you to literally check in on that program to various places. Google+, a little bit of a hybrid between Twitter and Facebook. And then, of course, there's Twitter, which is becoming what I think actually one of the more indispensable tools of the group. We're not going to talk about them specifically, but we're going to talk generally again around this idea of what social media is about in general. So if we go to the next slide. The other thing that makes social media quite different than what we've seen in some of the other technologies, the web technologies, the fact is that it really was designed principally to create content sharing opportunities virtually anywhere. And unlike traditional websites, which are often anchored very much towards a computer, whether that's a laptop or desktop, social media, again, most of the tools are designed for multi-platform environments. So they are just like the laptop there in the bottom left-hand corner, but they're for tablets, they are for mobile handsets. Most of them are platform independent, although you have to buy or download software for each one of them. Twitter will function regardless of which device you're using. Facebook will function in most cases the same regardless of what devices. When you use the web, you do get limitations. You actually have websites, for example, anything that has Flash cannot be accessed on an Apple portable device and that sort of thing. So if we go to the next slide, this is where we're getting into kind of the big thing. So why use social media for research? So if you're a researcher, and it looks like many of you are on something, and probably around Facebook, about half of you who voted are on Twitter, you may be wondering why, what is this particular topic about? Why would it be good for researchers and research? Well, one of the big things that you can think about is that it may not be what you traditionally think about. One of the things I would emphasize is the concept of idea development and hypothesis formation. One of the things that social media does, particularly because we have such high rates of penetration, Canada is among the most Facebooked countries in the world. Most of our citizens have a Facebook account. They may not use it all the time, but they do have one. People are highly engaged in Twitter. You have a chance to access populations and groups that you may have had no concept of how to reach in other ways. And that's something very fundamental. And not just access them in the sense of a kind of listening. You have a chance to listen in, but you actually have a chance to have direct contact with that. So if we take something like Twitter, Twitter is a very public medium, whereas Facebook is not. So if you have a Facebook account, you have to accept friends or be invited in to your particular circle or your friend circle. And of course, we can joke about the fact is that, are these your real friends? Are they partly friends? Are the friends you had in high school that you weren't friends with them after high school for a particular reason, and now they found you as an adult and that sort of thing. We can joke about that. But Twitter is different. Twitter is actually open. So it's Facebook. You post your message and all of your quote-unquote friends will see it. Twitter goes to the entire world. Same thing with YouTube, same thing with a lot of these ones. And there's a difference between these types of platforms and what they offer. But From a idea development and hypothesis formation thing, one of the things that we often struggle with in research is trying to look at formative kinds of details in advance of putting in a grant submission, for example. We often try and guess about things. Now, if you're working in highly innovative environments, which is where most of my research has existed, there's often no precedent for this stuff. We're working in areas that are very new, very novel. We have to do an awful lot of work just to get access to the formative run of data. What this allows us to do is to go in and see what are people talking about, what is important to them, what are the messages that they are sending. Are they creating YouTube videos on a particular topic? Are they tweeting about a particular thing? You have a chance to be able to find things. One of the things I talked about with Twitter is very much that Twitter, one way to characterize that is Twitter is a phenomenal vehicle for answering questions you never thought to ask from people you didn't know existed. Now that's a very powerful tool. So in addition to coming up with new ideas and maybe potential hypotheses, by being able to watch and listen to people acting out in the world, you then also have that opportunity to do some background research into topics. Again, this is a fantastic thing. I use Twitter. Twitter is probably my most valuable source for finding out cutting-edge research, what's going on out there. Now, you may find that interesting. I mean, yes, indeed, things like Medline searches and that is very interesting to be able to use, very comprehensive. But if you want to know what's coming out now, there are hundreds, potentially thousands of journals that could affect public and population health, outside of just the health sciences, social sciences, policy, and that sort of thing. What these tools, by people sharing things on Google+, putting something up on Twitter, or maybe even some of my colleagues who are my friends on Facebook posting it on theirs, I get a chance to see what the cutting edge is in terms of that as it comes out, without just getting email alerts. Because let's face it, none of us are starving for email. Social media is also a very powerful tool for data collection. Being very respectful, of course, but it is a very public space. So you have that opportunity to collect a lot of data about what's going on. What are people tweeting about? What's the world tweeting about? There's a number of tools out there that allow you to collect that kind of data and look at quantitatively and qualitatively what kind of things are being said on a particular topic. And we'll talk a little bit later on about some of the tools that you can use to do that. It's also really good for real-time evaluation feedback. Think about how many events that we've been to where, you give a talk or you're an audience member, and then, the conference organizers at the end are always begging you to try and fill out these big forms about, how did the conference work? What happened at this particular event? Or you're having something like an event, a community-oriented event. You always want people to fill out those. Well, we know from a research standpoint that that's terrible data most of the time because it's highly self-selective. Social media allows us a chance to get data that might be a little less problematic. It's also real time. What conferences are doing is, for example, is using things like a hashtag, which is a number sign plus a set of, a name, a number, something like that just gets invented on the spot. And you can use to track particular tweets or things. So it gives you that chance to get real-time evaluation feedback. Imagine being able to do a conference and see what people are thinking about that conference or event or phenomenon as it's happening. You roll out a press release. You roll out a policy. We get a chance to see what the public is thinking the moment that gets released. That is a potentially incredibly powerful tool. And using the Tri-Council guidelines, we do have the opportunity to collect that data without having to go through a massive ethical ethics review and that sort of thing. That said, there's always the demand to be very respectful and very, very cautious about using public data, because when you're using things like direct quotes and that, you can do a direct search in Google and eventually find that. And you do not want to get into a situation, whether we're ethically bound or not, to get permission. You want to be very respectful and careful about how you collect that data. But the point is, it's already there. And with things like events where you're using hashtags, it can be made very obvious that you're actually going to use that for a particular thing. The other thing is it can also be very good for error detection and correction. And I'm going to talk a little bit about researchers and that sort of stuff. But one of the things that we do is We talk so much about knowledge translation, and most of us are terrible at it. Researchers do not get trained very well in knowledge translation. We're getting better, and I'm applauding the Institute for getting journalists involved and that sort of stuff. Journalists are you and others out there who are doing great work in this thing. You are the better spokespeople for this than we are, for the most part. But the point is that we do have that opportunity to be able to see how some of our research is being used and interpreted and start to make error detection and corrections, because occasionally what happens is sometimes people will take a result and they may skew it in a particular way, not necessarily nefariously or anything like that. We have that chance to be able to see, are things being taken up in the ways that we kind of intended it to be. Well, if we go to the next slide. So now the question is, why would social media for researchers? Okay, so I've maybe made a case for what we might want to think about for research, but let's pick up on that whole thing about knowledge translation. We are charged with doing KT, and most of us do not know how to manage with journalists very well. Some of us don't like talking to the public. Some of us don't know how to do that stuff particularly well, or we don't have the resources in our labs, our universities, and that sort of stuff to be able to do that. All of this is getting better, and all of it's improving. But of course, all of us in doing research are faced with a lot of different demands on our time, and that's a real challenge for us. So one of the things that this does is provide us with an immediate knowledge translation exchange opportunity that is incredibly powerful. Imagine publishing a paper, and of course we'd love to have people read that. So you can tweet that out. You can put that up on a Facebook page, a Google Plus thing. Imagine doing things like doing a short video explaining what your study is talking about that you can put up online for people that have very low literacy levels, or people that maybe are not necessarily able to get access to the raw data or the paper or something like that. Imagine doing a 1 to 2 minute clip simply saying, here's what this study is all about. Here's what I think the benefits are, and that sort of thing. It also provides you with a great opportunity to get some exposure, but also some feedback from your colleagues, because people get a chance to see what's out there. Nobody can keep on top of the overwhelming amount of information, and if you are in a position of a teaching position, you know just as well as I do that you end up having lots of student demands, committee demands on top of your research and that sort of stuff. So we're not starved for time. The other thing is learning and professional development. I mentioned that entire idea of finding out answers to questions that you may not have thought to ask from people you didn't know exist. I get most of my information now about conferences, colloquia, events, or people I should be connecting through Twitter, actually, of all things. Some through Google+, some through Facebook and some other tools, and LinkedIn as well. LinkedIn is a very powerful, it's professional-oriented thing. If you don't have a profile on LinkedIn, you may want to think about that, because I've had more opportunities for collaboration, for sharing knowledge, for being able to speak generated through social media than I have anything else, and that's not because I do social media research and that sort of thing. Part of it, yes, but it's because I'm out there, because I'm visible. And it also makes me far more accessible than simply going through university directories to try and find things out or searching the web. People may not know my particular specialty even exists. And the fact that they can follow things on social media and they start to see, wait, I'm talking about the things that are interesting to them, they can start to find me. And so the same thing with you, whether you're studying genomics, whether you are studying health equity, whether you're studying anything out there, psychology, behavioral science, health promotion, epidemiology, all of these things, you get a chance to speak not only to your peers, but also to the public. I mentioned identification of collaborators. I've made some fantastic collaborative relationships and friendships using social media. People find me on Twitter, and they say, hey, I find it interesting. Armin very kindly talked about following me on Twitter. And but you can see what's on my mind. You can see very clearly what I tweet is what I'm interested in and what I'm interested in sharing. And so from that, people can start to determine a little bit about what it is that I'm interested in, what I do. Lastly, is increasing the visibility and citation impact factor. This is the stuff that's going to get us maybe more grants. It's going to get us promoted. It's going to get us our raises and all that sort of stuff like that. And we just simply, I think, the most purest reason to do this is because we want to get our research out there. How do we do that? We can use social media for research. And if we go to the next slide, I want to give a big nod to my good friend and colleague, Gunther Eisenbach, who is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Medical Internet Research, which is the leading health services research thing. But Gunther actually started to think about this. What he does through his journal is he tweets quite frequently, the journal does, about what's come out in his journal. And he has a number of different articles that come out every week, every year. And what he did is took a look and said, is there a correlation between tweets and predicted citations? Sure enough, what he found is that the more something gets tweeted, the more likely it can predict what gets cited down the road. So what he's actually been able to show is that a social media presence has a direct benefit, potential benefit, on citation impact and citations overall. That's a very powerful thing from a very particular knowledge translation perspective, and something we really do need to pay attention to. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things that we have to do, I mentioned about this idea about thinking differently. So this is a little bit about why we should do that. This is a network map that's developed through a free software program called NodeXL. So if you're interested in social networking stuff, it's a great free program that tacks on to the PC version of Microsoft Excel. This is just showing connections between people. When you're using social media, whether it's for data capture, whether it's for learning, whether it is for knowledge translation, all of those things, you want to be thinking about networks. It's not just the one-to-one connection you're making online. It is at who those people are connected to. And when you start to think in networks, you start to realize the potential for very rapid dissemination, very rapid aggregation of information, and that sort of thing. It is an enormously powerful tool. This is Twitter. The same thing goes from comments on YouTube, whether you're sharing links via Facebook, Google+, LinkedIn, or something like that. Networks upon networks upon networks. Twitter, perhaps, might be the fastest moving of the bunch, but nonetheless, it's there's a whole bunch of them, and you have to really think about, again, I mentioned some of the PTCC webinars. Think strategically. There's actually a strategy one we do. But think about what you're trying to accomplish, because each one of these media will do things slightly differently. You can use them all, or you can choose to use one or the other. So if we go to the next slide, one of the other fundamental things that you have to get your mind around is this idea about you're not just broadcasting to the world. Yes, you can use any one of these tools just to tell anybody anything. But what I'd like you to do is to think a little bit about conversations. And the really interesting thing is I had a wonderful privilege about a week ago to sit down with Gilbert Reed, polymath. He's done some work for the CBC. He's got a great series on France and Italy on CBC's ideas. Well worth listening to. One of the things that Gilbert talked about was, particularly with France and both of those cultures, but is the cafe culture. And I was really captivated by that. I'm a big coffee fan. I roast coffee beans as a hobby. I'm some people would say I'm a coffee snob, but I love coffee. But I love the cafe experience. It was some of the best moments of my life as an undergrad. But when you think about cafes and creating conversations, what makes a good conversation is really what makes social media, most of the time, pop. It's about give and take. It is about engagement versus broadcasting. It's about talking to people. And just like any good conversation, it's about sharing stuff. We academics we have to be prodded into sharing our research sometimes. We're very, very protective. I would like to encourage you to start thinking about sharing more. The more you share, the more you get back. And it's very evident once you start doing this online. That's why if you see I tweet many, many times a day, I read things, I program tweets in, I do it live, I do all sorts of different things. You also have to realize that the conversation has a different cadence and a different pace of information flow. Just like any good conversation, it goes fast, it goes slow, it changes all the time. It's not necessarily a linear kind of process. The other thing is that it's very developmental. So the outcomes are developmental and evolving and complex. Just like you may start a conversation on a particular topic, you may not end on that same topic. Any good conversation we've had, I don't think would be something that we would predict as being something very linear. We start talking about one thing before I know it, because we're Canadians, we talk about the weather. And then we start talking about maybe hockey, or we start about something we saw on television, then get back to something political, scientific, and that sort of thing. And generally a good conversation is all about that. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things I want to do before I end and just talk to you about some metrics and outcomes is to ask the question, what is an effective conversation? When people often ask me, well, what is the effective use of social media? That, I would argue, is the wrong question to ask. We ask that of almost everything else we do in health sciences, but it's probably not the best thing to ask about here in social media. What is an effective conversation? You've probably had a good one, terrible one. You've probably had ones that have gotten you excited, gotten you, titillated, all sorts of different things, are angry, but you've probably not had effective conversations. You may have wanted to get something out of a conversation, but I'm not sure you could say it was an effective one. That is a change of the mindset within social media. There is effective broadcasting that reaches a certain number of people in a certain audience segment that allows you to also get a certain set of outcomes. Social media is not that. It does allow you to get outcomes. It does allow you to get those things, but those things are not a low linear trajectory. So if we go to the next slide, we're just going to introduce sort of the final little stage here, and that's talking about measurement and metrics, because we're scientists. We're all about show me the money, show me what this actually does. And if we go down to the next slide here, metrics and indicators, and I've just sort of lumped them all in here because obviously this is something that we could talk about for hours. But we don't have hours. We've got about another 5 minutes and then some conversation. So some of the things to take a look at. Now, I've lumped everything together because it also depends on what medium you're using. So take this with a bit of a grain of salt. Think about it. Look online. Feel free to contact me, that sort of thing. However it works. Go to the social media workshop that's being delivered in Montreal. That's probably a good idea, too. So one of the things to think about is the number of contact or engagement points. So this may be things like numbers of followers on Twitter, number of comments, number of subscribers on YouTube, number of network connections on LinkedIn, number of friends on Facebook, number of likes on a particular page on Facebook. These are good things because there's the number of people around there. However, what I would tell you to do is that not to use those things bluntly, because there's an issue around quality versus also quantity. So the type of contacts is also important. So what kind of contacts are there? I would argue for myself, I would much rather have a smaller number of people following me and have them be the right people who are going to enrich my own personal knowledge base, help me achieve my goals, than lots and lots of people. And there have been some examples of marketing where you have people who, campaigns that have been run where you have lots and lots of people who have very superficial followers. You see this often with celebrities, versus people who've truly cultivated relationships with their audience, whatever that audience is. If you're interested in this, there's a paper that an editorial I wrote for Health Promotion Health Promotion International that came on in December, where I talk about audience in a very McLuhan-esque kind of way, but it does start to address this. Type of contacts and numbers of contacts, so those are things to think about. If you're trying to generate ideas or leads or test ideas, you also want to take a look at the quality, number, and type of ideas generated. So what kind of things? It's not just that people liked your page, did they comment? And you could say awesome, LOL, or great, or interesting, or something like that. But at the same time, what if people actually say, that's an interesting point, here's something else that they're adding to the conversation? Just like you can have conversations, those cafe conversations that are very, very, the things you kind of have in an elevator, you have around the water cooler. Did you watch the hockey game last night? Yeah, it was pretty good. Oh, that was interesting. Oh, did you see that little article in the paper? Oh, it was interesting. That was good. Versus the very deep, substantive ones. It's not necessarily to say good or bad, but you get different kinds of information from both of those. And one of the things I would say, because we have researchers on the line, is that oftentimes we get stuck, I like to say stuck, in that whole Quantitative versus qualitative debate. I say toss that out the window with social media. You need both. If you are looking at networks and extended periods of time, you need to understand quantitative numbers. You need to understand how those numbers play out in patterns. You also need to understand context. No matter whether you're dealing in tens, thousands, millions, context matters enormously. You have to be paying attention to both. Citations and references, if we use Gunther's, look, are people taking up the idea? Are you sharing a link, and are other people sharing their links on top of that? What's the kind of quality of engagements and interactions? Are they achieving what you want to achieve? Are they more or less? Or are you getting something new, something unexpected, that sort of thing? And then also, again, to think about network. Social network analysis can be partly useful for this. I think it gets overused, partly because there's a lot of wonderful things that social networking does in terms of a method, but having used it, there's also a lot of limitations around sample size and missing data that allows an incredible recipe for making all kinds of poor extrapolations from your data. I just want to say caution to that, so think about that very carefully when you're using it. So if we go to the second last slide, so how do we get any of this stuff? There's a whole pile of tools out there that are built into some of these technologies and that are either low cost or free. On the left-hand side, you'll see the free, low-cost. Facebook Insights is a tool that's built into Facebook. If you have a minimum number of, I believe it's 35 people who like your page, you get access to Facebook Insights. It collects all kinds of data, number of visitors, how long they're there, that sort of thing. Very much the same thing as Google Analytics. Another great service from Google that you can offer is Google Alerts. So if you're trying to track about what people are saying about you, your research, your topic, or something like that, you can set up a Google alert, and it basically will send you a notice every time somebody mentions you within a context. It takes a while to set up because you've got to get the language just right, but it's very, very simple. There's a couple of other few tools out there, Hootsuite, Bottlenose, Buffer, and CoTweet. These are all different kinds of tools that work with different technologies. CoTweet obviously is on Twitter. I personally, and I'm not getting paid to endorse this, I actually like using Hootsuite, and I also use Bottlenose, partly because they're very robust, they're very simple to use, and you can use them for free. If you want to use a number of other accounts, you can do that too. So they're just things to take a look out there. I would honestly tell you, go try them out. Most of them are free, or at least have a free sample, a trial period. See what works for you, what you like. Also, how you tweet or how you post. If you're doing it mostly off your mobile, you may want to use something different than you would, say, a desktop or something like that. Premium, I also have Hootsuite and Bottlenose. Both of those have professional level accounts that give you a little bit more data analytics. Hootsuite is runs, and I don't know if Bottlenose is just rolling out its pricing. Hootsuite is less than $10 a month. You can also get into some very sophisticated stuff where you get massive big data engines powering things like Radian6, Sysomos, Belove, and SM2. They are very powerful. They will give you a lot of data, but you have to have a lot of data to look at. So if you're not heavily presenced on social media and you're trying to understand your own stuff, it might be a bit of overkill. These things run anywhere from $100 to $1,000 a month in terms of subscriptions and that sort of stuff. Good for an institution. It might be overkill for an individual researcher. What I would suggest you do is try something out, see how it works. In all cases, try something out, see how it works. Just to conclude, if you're getting on social media, you don't need to jump into every pond at the same time. Try it out. You're not going to break. It's not like the old days of computers where you try something and suddenly your IT person is there. Get a Twitter account. Maybe just follow people for a while. Maybe just try a little tweet here and there, see what kind of reaction you get. And there's no one way to do this because whoever starts following you will help dictate that thing. Whoever comes to your conversation will change that. So my experience will be slightly different than yours and that sort of thing. Try on Facebook. Try playing with that. Google+. Try those things out. You have to be respectful of your own time. Think about how long it takes to do this sort of stuff, how long it takes to learn. But it should be fun. Express your voice. Don't be afraid of it. It's not going to break you. And there's no one way to do it. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to continue the conversation.
Okay, I guess it's time to take some of these questions. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the questions in order that they appeared on the whiteboard. And the first question on our list in the whiteboard was, awesome question, how do you avoid gluts of information?
You know what? I don't think the short answer is you cannot. A better answer is that you can be very selective. So on Twitter, you can choose to follow very particular people. I also mentioned, I saw a question up there about. I mentioned that Twitter's open to the world. You can close your Twitter account. You can actually have it restricted. That may be useful for very particular things. For the most part, I would say caution you against doing that because you don't derive a lot of the peer benefits from it, but that's a choice you have to make. In terms of the glut, I would say just like food, you can have too much because the more this could be an obesity problem if you really wanted to turn it into that. You just have to be very careful and selective about filtering things. One of the things that I found that was really useful for me is the day I kind of gave up trying to read it all. And what I do is I usually have a couple of times a day that I choose to actually have social media time, and I sometimes add more to it than that. But and just be willing to just read my Twitter, for example, my Twitter feed up to a certain point. Like I will miss tweets. That's fine. I will miss Facebook posts. That's fine. I mean, once you can love yourself enough to do that, I think that's okay. I also make a point of every so often culling my list because occasionally people stop tweeting or they become less relevant, and I stopped following them on Twitter. I don't necessarily give up my friends on Facebook, but I may ask to see less of their content and that sort of stuff. So just it's a living thing. Just be careful. Just like food, there's times to gorge and there's times to be a little lean on things. But basically, at the end of the day, just be kind to yourself.
Thanks, Cameron. The next question was from early in your presentation where you were indicating how you can use the social media forums to actually gather research and in what people were saying. And the question was, clarification, do we need permission to use an online quote or not?
The short answer is no. The longer answer is yes. It depends. I think it depends on how you're using it. If in fact, and I alluded to this in the presentation, unlike anything else, while it is in the public domain, if you look at the Tri-Council guidelines, it is public, so anybody can get at it. But what you're doing as a researcher is you're calling attention to it. And you want to be very respectful of that. And so you have to be very, very judicious in thinking about what kind of context was that statement made in. Is that putting somebody at a particularly vulnerable position? And is that something that you should think about? As good practice, it usually never hurts to be, for example, if you're looking at a particular tweet, just send them a direct message and say, by the way, this is a great tweet. I'd love to use this in a research thing, and here's how. And you can put a link to your website, or you can do whatever you'd like. There's lots of ways to do that, and it doesn't take that long, and most people are very, very kind and flattered about doing that. I've done that with presentations, that sort of thing. You don't have to, but again, I think that it behooves us as researchers to go beyond what we're just required to do to probably what we should do from an ethical and respectful standpoint.
That's terrific. So the next question is a cool one. How do you get more people following us on Twitter?
You know what I would say? The number one thing is talk about cool stuff. There's lots of ways that you can game the system, and we see this in marketing all the time. It's often why if you find people who are particularly in the marketing, I'm just picking on them, but they'll have 25,000 followers, and you think, what the heck? And they don't have much to say because there's certain fields out there where they know how to game that. So the idea is that if everybody follows each other all the time, I'm not sure that's useful. I don't find that useful at all. What I find is talk about stuff that's of interest to you. I mean, it sounds a bit trite, but if you're talking with passion and conviction, it requires a bit of sensitivity to clarity in how you do that. But I find I follow people that share really neat stuff that gets me excited, that helps my work, that helps my life, that sort of stuff like that. The more you do that, the more people are going to retweet what you do. And that's why having the open networks for Twitter, less so with Facebook because it's a bit different, non-protected sites on YouTube and that kind of stuff, the more you share and the more that stuff has value for your audiences, whoever those audiences are, the more likely people are going to share what you shared. And that's going to draw people to you. And the interesting thing is that it truly is a virtuous cycle, because the more you share, the more other people will share, the more people will follow you, the more times you'll be alerted to cool things to share, and you can share that again. And the interesting thing is eventually you'll get recommended. We can see things like with almost every one of these social media platforms has a, oh, if you're following Armeen, she tweets about this cool stuff. You might also like to follow this person because they tweet something kind of similar to her, and that sort of thing. So it also can draw you into attention for a lot of other people. It also can put you in that position of being the person that gets recommended.
Okay. How about if, a very good question. If we don't have regular research updates, what else should we be tweeting about?
Good question. So you can choose to do whatever you want. I mean, some people make it very personal. If you follow my tweets, I do mostly of the kind of workish related stuff. Occasionally I throw random stuff out there. Most people will know kind of my hobbies and my interests, and you know, in fact, most people, I actually tend to get a boost in followers when I give a sense of who I am as a person. You don't have to do that. That's my own personal choice to do that. But what I would tell you to do is this is where it's a great knowledge translation exercise for us. We often have way more to say than we actually give ourselves credit for. So we publish a study, and maybe our next study doesn't come out for another 3 or 4 months. Talk about some of the lessons in collecting the data. I mean, the thing that frustrates the heck out of me is that how often my research papers are such profound disappointments to me. And I mean that in the sense of how much gets left on the cutting room floor, so to speak. There's so many stories to say about how we got the data. And I'm not talking about going out of telling tales out of school in terms of ethically, disclosing stuff. I'm talking about the journey as a scientist, what it meant to come up with the idea, what it meant to make those decisions about what to include and what not to include in a manuscript, what it meant to be able to sit back and think about who's going to use this, like what is the policymaker going to do with this? And again, you as a journalist, you know this stuff. You are so much better at this stuff than most of us are. But even to start to thinking about how journalists approach things, what might my audience think? What might they want from this? So there's a whole kind of story. Well, another thing, share what you're reading. You read a great paper and you go, this is fantastic. I think people who are like me might find this interesting. I just today, I think I did send out 3 tweets on papers that I thought, this is pretty cool, evidence-based policy, very interesting, and I'm going to share it with the rest of the world, and hopefully, because I've benefited so much because people have done the exact same thing with me. So you have a lot more to say than I think most people think.
Do you, the question is do you, but I wonder what you think about multiple accounts, the same person holding multiple accounts, or are you seamless in your online presence between personal and professional?
I have a bit of both. I'm somewhere in the middle. I am seamless in the sense of that there's very little stuff that I have a company website that because when I left U of T, I do consulting and that stuff. I have that. The voice that is through that account is a little more reserved. I make no bones about the fact is that it's me. Maybe one day the company will be gigantic and I'll have tons of people doing it. But the point is that it's. I wanted that Twitter account, for example, or that Google Plus page for that particular company to have a very particular look and feel. Because I know that people might be encountering that in a different sense than they're encountering me. In terms of when you're following me, you're following me. You're getting the unbridled me. You're getting my own personal perspective. There's advantages and disadvantages to both. People like people. So the more personal you make it to a point, it's nice to be able to follow somebody as opposed to something. It's really up to you, and you have to try and think about what your strategy is. In some cases where you actually have institutes, like Institute for Population Public Health, it may be very difficult to be able to, you may want to have a corporate presence that has a very particular lens to it. Companies vary in their approach. I always like using Dell as an example. Dell actually encourages their IT staff to tweet very personal things as well. So they talk about basketball as well as repairs and all that sort of stuff like that. It works for them. It doesn't work for everybody. So it's just a personal call. What makes it just adds a little bit of complexity to things, but not that much.
So what's the best time of day to post things? Are there any certain times of day that are better that you have found in terms of getting the most attention?
That's a great question. You know what? One of the ways to cheat is, so I mentioned I use Hootsuite. Hootsuite is a program that actually, they have this thing called auto-schedule, and what's really funny is that you can actually program your tweets. Like, for example, Twitter or a post. I shouldn't say it's just tweets. It actually uses a number of different things. But what's interesting is that, oftentimes if you're reading things, like I tend to do things in chunks, as I mentioned. Problem is, if you have this big stream of 30 tweets or 10 tweets in a row, it's kind of a bit of overkill. What it does is it actually watches the traffic in your own personal network and actually programs it anchored to very specific times. That's one answer. The second answer is it really does depend on your audience. For example, I have a lot of people for various reasons who follow me from Australia and a few from the UK, colleagues and that stuff. So I'm getting, for them, I hit them at a different time than I hit here in North America. There's also some people that are very attentive to my posts, and I'm attentive to theirs, that tend to do early morning. The evidence for what there is out there mostly suggests that the highest time for traffic tends to be about 8:30 in the morning till about 11 a.m. in the morning. That's oftentimes because people are getting to the office, they're opening up their browser, and they're doing that sort of stuff like that. But that is a very loose set of goals. One of the things that you will see, the more you do this, is you get automatic feedback coming back. When people repost, like your page, anything like that, you'll start to see within your own community of interest when people do that, and you'll start to be able to pick up those patterns. So I'd like to say there's one answer, but really isn't.
Okie doke. And I'm going to have to make this the last question. The last question with social media that we're going to take today is, have you yourself used Pinterest and Instagram to promote your research? How would you recommend using these platforms?
Fantastic question. And you know what? I haven't. Which is funny. It is actually kind of funny because I do a lot of visual stuff. I haven't, partly because I haven't had the opportunity. Most of the research that I've used over the last year and a half, oddly, has been rhetorical. And unfortunately, with words, it's good. I often think about that, and I do think there's a lot of potential to do that. We do graphs, we do visual stuff, or even qualitative, like things like photo voice. I used to do a lot of stuff with participatory photography and that. It'd be a great avenue to do it. I'd love to say I've used it. I haven't. I definitely think about it. If you do have visual stuff, it's really, really nice. It's a nice way to do things because it's just a little bit different. None of us are scrambling for stuff to read, and there is some good ways to do that. Interestingly enough, both of those sites, because of the way visuals are harder to index in a way for popular, it's harder for people to find them. People are finding them. Pinterest is becoming really, really popular. But one of the ways to do that is to actually start slow and start to retweet or repost on Facebook or Google+, whatever you're using, things of Instagram. There's a lot of people. American Public Health Association is doing a great job with Instagram. They've got a great Twitter feed or Instagram feed. They're doing some neat stuff. Ottawa Public Health, their group, Ottawa Public Health, they've been using Pinterest. Really neat stuff. Really, really good stuff. So there's a lot out there.
That's very cool. I'm going to turn it over to Emma now, and thank you very much for a fabulous presentation, Dr. Norman.
Oh, thank you very much. Nice talking to you, Armin.
Thanks to Armin for your job moderating, and to Cameron for your great presentation, and to everyone who participated. It's been wonderful discussion, and we will follow up. If you registered, we have your email address. If not, please contact us, and we'll make sure you get all the follow-up, including a short evaluation questionnaire so that we can get some feedback for future events. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.